Greeting consciousness. This is Isicera, and I'm here today to talk about one of the things that I really enjoy, helices, and how they're really fascinating, and I think understanding them more can lead to greater consciousness. So, what is a helice? Right now, this just looks like a circle, and a helice is the creation of a circle along another dimensional axis that's perpendicular to it. So as you could see, the helix is just a shape that is the circle being created as it moves in a direction. It's a really fascinating thing to think of as a contrast to cylinder, which is the more static form of understanding a circle that is generated along a line. So, let's talk about some of the other things that are really fascinating about helices. For one, they're a great expression of how the universal grid of understanding things as a universal XYZ axis is very different from the perspective we get as entities that use our input of light in order to understand the world around us. If we look universally, the shape of a helix is going to just be a circle when you view it from the end. But if instead you're able to change perspective on to see what it looks like through human eyes, if you look, it looks like a spiral. It's a great sign to show the contrast of how we view things versus how they are, and how that both generates complexity and also is able to shift our views in order to generate ways of understanding the world from more perspectives. So, one of the things that's really fascinating about the helice is that it has internal referential iteration, which means that it repeats the same thing over and over, and it manages to do this with a simple set of instructions. So as you could see, this pattern continues to repeat over and over and over and over again. This lets it do some amazing things that a lot of other shapes that are comparatively simple in how they're generated don't have the capability of expressing in the same ways. Some things that are interesting about this is, since each point you could see whenever it reaches that same point again when viewed as a circle, you could use it for understanding dimensional axes in a greater way. Along with this, when you look at it as polarities of a division in between a crest point and a trough point, which you could just do by figuring out the length of one iteration, then dividing it by 2, and then no matter what the situation is, you'll be able to find what that halfway point is and how that shows the opposite location on the helix. This is really fascinating since it represents oscillation in this way. Oscillation is just when things move back and forth, and something moving back and forth is pretty much how we understand heat to exist, because heat's made out of vibration, and vibration is made out of oscillation. So, being able to understand how that works is a really fascinating way to gain wisdom from the helix. Along with this, because it has this format, you could understand it both as a circle along an axis of space, or the creation of a circle along the axis of time. Because if time is our dimension from left to right on this screen, you'll be able to see that even if you're making a circle, but as time's moving forward it changes, you're able to generate the shape of a helix. So it's a really great representation of how time can be represented with a solid. And this is interesting both in how it rotates and how it translates. Okay, one of the things that I really appreciate is that it also represents how a single force functions on multiple scales. An example is the orbit of planets. People have pretty traditionally thought of them as circular motions around our star. That takes our star as as a static object that doesn't happen to be moving itself. Our star, the sun, is moving, and it's moving quite a lot. So what the rotation of the orbiting of the planets looks like is actually way closer to a helix. This is a way of understanding how the same force gravity on multiple different scales is able to interrelate in order to generate something new, complex, and interesting. Along with this, I really appreciate how helices have the ability to represent symmetry through iteration as opposed to bilaterally. So, symmetry is things being the same in different ways. Most people are familiar with bilateral symmetry, where something on the left appears functionally the same as something on the right. That's not the only way for there to be symmetry. Symmetry could exist in many different formats, and one of the fascinating ones is helices, because they show symmetry as represented by iteration, and that's a really fascinating concept because it combines multiplicity and singularity into one thing, and it's so amazing in that way. About the orbits and helices, there's also a link that I'm going to put in the description that shows a video of this that's pretty fascinating to see. And there's also a link that I'm going to put for how symmetry in helices functions, because there's a really fascinating thing that using helical symmetry, you can generate a lot of things with a much smaller amount of information. This is a reason that viruses use helical symmetry as a way to structure themselves, or many viruses, such as the first primary virus we studied, which infected tobacco, was actually one that used helical symmetry. Link in this description for understanding helical symmetry in viruses. So, along with that, it's also a representation of polarities. So what do I mean by polarities? Polarities in this case, people think of opposites, like a top and a bottom. The helix is a great way of expressing that opposites are actually part of a continuum, and they aren't even necessarily any farther apart than other things on the same continuum. If we look from the side, we could see that from left to right in this situation is just as far apart as from up to down, and being able to understand the expression of polarity from a more complete angle of intersecting higher dimensional objects is really a great way to increase one's consciousness. So, something that's pretty obvious that you probably noticed by now is helices is a representation of a waveform. It's not exactly one on its own, but if you combine two helices of inverted chiralities, you'll be able to see that that generates a waveform. And it's pretty easy to see even if you just look from a side angle on a single helix. But there's links in the description in order to understand how inverse chiralities are able to generate a waveform out of a 3D object. So, speaking of waveforms, why did I bring that up? Waveforms are fascinating for a lot of reasons. First, waveforms are how the electromagnetic spectrum functions, which is what we use to see. Visible light comes from that. They're also the way that sound functions. So, understanding waveforms brings a really great completeness to helices that aren't found in a lot of other simple objects. So, what I mean by this completeness is that they represent a physical structure, as all physical objects do. They represent time based on how they iterate in its iteration of creation. They represent energy because oscillation is a simpler format of vibration, and vibration is where heat comes from, and heat is one of the energies that makes up our reality. Along with this, it also represents awareness and consciousness in a lot of ways, because all things we see and all the things we hear, we only see and hear because helices are reaching our eyes and ears. So that's really a fascinating way to get all of that from a very simple shape. I have links in the description that cover things in the electromagnetic spectrum and all kinds of other stuff about this. So, another thing that happens to be fascinating about the helix is that helixes can stack. You could put a helix along another helix, and that lets it generate information in a different way. This is actually why a sound like a C played on a piano and played on a guitar, even though they're both Cs, sound differently because they have different smaller helices that are interacting with the larger helix. So there's information about that in the description as well. So, more cool things about helices. I'm almost done sharing things for the day, though there's always more to learn about these amazing structures. So, if you look at right here near the center, there's this line that goes from down left to up right. If I rotate the helix, look at where that line moves. It appears to move downwards. This is a fascinating factor of helices in that they could be used to translate rotation into translation, and they could convert that energy for other things, which is amazing. Being able to convert something that is moving in place to something that is moving through space is amazing and awesome, and I have more things about that I would like to discuss, but that's for another video. So I'm only going to cover 2 more things about how amazing helices are right now, and the first of which is that understanding the complex plane, or the square root of -1 in relation to how it functions within our reality and imaginary numbers in general, can be much easier understood if we think of numbers as vectors with rotation, and it's easy to see how the complex plane functions when we understand it as a complex plane that is wrapped along a helix as opposed to just like a flat plane that's nowhere. I have a link in the description that I highly recommend. It's animated, it makes it easy to understand, and it has it easily repeatable, easily understandable. I really recommend the link that I'm going to put in the description for this. So finally, the way most people are exposed to what a helices are is they've heard of DNA, which builds us and all other life on this planet, or all other biological life that we're aware of on this planet. And it's pretty amazing. It's a double helix, so as opposed to just one helix, it is a series of 2 helices that are wrapped around each other. And more fascinating is it's an example of helix stacking, that thing I was saying earlier when covering sound, because those 2 wrapped helices are wrapped as a greater whole into a bigger helix. So I think that covers what I want to share today when it comes to helices, and I hope that this has been as fascinating and fun for you as it has been for me to learn and discover all these things about this amazing shape. I hope that you have a beautiful and blessed day and that this wisdom serves you well. Ciao!